Good afternoon, everybody. This is Pastor Clint coming to you from my office at Grace Covenant. Getting you ready for worship this week. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of John. This will be week 5, so the next to the last week. We're doing this in conjunction with our small groups and the Adam Hamilton study on John. So people seem to have been really enjoying that and getting a lot out of it, so that's fantastic. So last week we looked at John's version of the Last Supper. I didn't get a chance to do a video of that one because I was under the weather last week a little bit. So that means that today we are on to the Good Friday passages, the betrayal, trial, and crucifixion of Jesus. So it's going to be kind of heavy this Sunday because you can't talk about these texts without it being having a certain tone to it. So in the video today, what I wanted to do was just kind of walk you through some of the aspects of this text. The Good Friday text is somewhat similar to the Christmas story text in that the version of it that we have in our heads is kind of a mix of all of the Gospels put together. It's not quite as stark and easy to untangle as it is with the Christmas story text, but it's still there. And the Gospels sort of agree in broad outline, but a lot of the detail and shading is different. And a lot of that difference is the difference in what they're in, the story they're trying to tell. The Gospels, because and the way that the Gospels are alike and different is like that too. In general, they're all trying to tell the same story. They're trying to tell the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and what it means for us as human beings. And that's the big headline, and they all are doing that in their own way. But the way they tell the story, and the details they include, and the stories they include, the choices that the gospel writers were making help cast Jesus in a little bit different light. And we, scholars think that a lot of that had to do with who the audience was for the early gospel writers. We don't have any evidence to think that any of them thought they were writing something that 2,000 years from now people would still be reading. In fact, they all expected Jesus to return pretty soon. So the fact that it's 2,000 years later and he hasn't come back yet, it would be pretty shocking to them. So they were all writing to their own communities in their own way and lifting up different aspects of Jesus' story and calling out to the stories of their culture and the stories of the Old Testament in some very intentional and deliberate ways, and they do that differently. And so that's one piece of this to remember. So I wanted to walk you through John's version of this story and sort of highlight a few things that make John's gospel unique. Some of the most iconic moments that are in our head from the Good Friday story are details from John. There's a couple of those in particular that I'll highlight. But the broad outline, so they finish the Last Supper, and they go out. They go to a garden. The Garden of Gethsemane is what it's called in the other Gospels, but that detail is not included in John. It just says they go out to a garden. And Judas comes with the temple authorities and with the Roman authorities. They arrest Jesus, they take him back, they put him on trial. The trial sort of goes back between the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities, and there's some push and pull in that, and that's one of those places where the Gospels deal differently with the details, and that tells us something. But Jesus is sentenced to death. He is crucified, and he dies, and his body is taken and put in the tomb, and that's sort of the broad outline of the Good Friday story. In John's version of the story, the tone is a little different from what we get in the other Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels spend a lot of time showing Jesus struggling with what's about to happen. We don't see that in John. There's no trying to get the disciples to stay awake when they're falling asleep. Sort of what happens in the garden, that part of the story is not in John. And that's important to know, because what John's trying to really get across as far as sort of the theme and Jesus' attitude about what's going on is, Jesus is not the reluctant hero. Jesus is not torn about this. Jesus knows this is going to happen. He knows that it has to happen, that it's supposed to happen, and he is going confidently and courageously into this. There's no, Father, take this cup from me, but not my will be done, but yours. John leaves any of that kind of stuff out. For John, Judas shows up, and and confronts the people who were there to arrest him. He's the first one to speak. So they show up, and Jesus says, "Who are you looking for?" Before they get a chance to say or do anything, they say, "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth," and in classic John language, this is something we should expect. Jesus replies, "I am he." So we get another one of those little "I am" statements in there. And it said when he says that, they all. It says that they say when Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. So it's like they're kind of like blown back by him, and they're sort of forced into this bowing posture. But they get up and they come to arrest them, and he says, "I'm here. I'm the one you want. Let these other people go." Peter takes out his sword and chops off somebody's ear. Jesus rebukes him for doing that. And then they're on to the high priest. And this is another place where it's a little different. In John, we don't get a scene where Jesus is appearing before the whole group of the Jewish elders called the Sanhedrin. In John's story, Jesus goes to the high priest. He goes to Caiaphas and Annas. And they really are the ones who are doing this. And then they sent him to Pilate for judgment. While all this is happening, we get Peter denying Jesus as well, and that's sort of woven into the story. The different gospel writers deal with that differently. Some of them sort of tell the trial story and then tell the Peter story, but in John it's kind of woven together. So you get Jesus is going before the high priest, Peter denies Jesus, and then we get the high priest questioning Jesus. Peter denies him again. Jesus goes to Pilate, is taken before Pilate, and the Jewish authorities are pushing Pilate to pronounce judgment. Pilate doesn't want to do that. Pilate has a conversation with Jesus, And this is one of those iconic moments, is Pilate and Jesus together, where Pilate is asking Jesus if he is a king. And with the rationale of that, the reason Pilate's asking him that, the reason that's important is if Jesus is saying he's a king, he's setting himself up in opposition to Caesar, to the Roman emperor, God king, and so that's what Pilate's trying to get him to do, because that's something he would execute him for. And Jesus's response is neither yes nor no. He says, my kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to them. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. And Pilate says, so you are a king. And then Jesus says, you say that I'm a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. And then Pilate famously asks, what is truth? Sort of, what probably the moment in his life that Pontius Pilate is known for most is that question, what is truth? But Jesus is sort of having a debate with him. Jesus never comes right out and says, yes, I am a king. He talks about his kingdom and his kingdom not being of this world. And then he turns from the question of being a king to the question of truth. Now we remember from the Last Supper, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. And so Pilate, that should be in our heads when we get to Pilate's question of what is the truth. What is the truth? Jesus is the truth. And Pilate doesn't see it, doesn't recognize it. And so that's that part of it. So Jesus is sentenced to death. Pilate tries to take him out and release him, but the crowd shouts for Barabbas. And that's that. So they take Jesus out, they flog him. The crowds are chanting to crucify him. And Pilate is in a real interesting position, because in John's version of the story, he clearly doesn't want to do this, but he's feeling political pressure to do it. And so he's trying to do it in the way that sort of, I'm doing this, but I'm not doing it. Or I want as little to do with this decision as possible, even though he's really the only one whose decision it is. But Pilate sends him out to be crucified. And so here's another one of the places where John's version of Jesus, John's way of telling the story looks different. In the synoptic versions of the story, Jesus is kind of worn down and debilitated by now, and has to have somebody else carry the beam for him. The way the crosses got carried was the vertical part that goes in the ground, that's already set up at the place where they would be crucified. But the crossing bar, the bar that his hands would go on, that's the part he has to carry. And famously in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is unable to carry it because he's been so beaten and tortured. If you've seen Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, really sort of leans into that part of it. But in John's version, that's not the way the story gets told. This is what it says. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. So John includes that, carrying the cross by himself. So that John wants us to see sort of a strong Jesus intentionally going and moving towards this end. So they take Jesus to Golgotha. They get there. They divide up his clothes. And then we get one of the other sort of iconic moments from John of this story, the way he tells it. And this is one of those kernels that is unique to John. One of those stories that we only get in John's gospel. And that is the exchange between Jesus and the beloved disciple and Mary. So Jesus is up on the cross, and the women are there, and the way John describes it is, Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her. It doesn't say who it is. Presumably, the traditional interpretation of that, and to me the interpretation that makes the most sense, is John is the one who it's talking about. If you've ever read like the Da Vinci Code, the sentence before that says, Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister Mary, wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother. And so the Da Vinci Code way of doing that is that Mary Magdalene is the disciple whom Jesus loved. From the text, it doesn't mention the beloved disciple previously. So, but it doesn't fit with the rest of the story, because then it goes on, Jesus sees them there together and says, "Woman, here is your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. So, but if you're familiar with the Da Vinci Code, that's where they get this whole part of this whole Mary Magdalene thing comes from that line in the story. But it's clear that there was from the rest of the story, it's pretty clear that there was a male disciple there who, from that moment, sort of took care of Mary after her oldest son is killed. So then Jesus says, "It is finished," which once again is, sort of stands out. This is sort of Jesus is up there, says it is finished, and it says, then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Like, this is not just something that's happening to Jesus. Jesus is an active participant in what's going on. So Jesus dies. They come and they pierce his side. Rather than breaking his legs, which would have been the normal practice. And Jesus is taken, and his body is given to Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, and they go and they place his body in the tomb. And that's where this part of the story ends. Excuse me. So that's the Good Friday story according to John. Like I said, it's a little different than the synoptics. It functions differently, somewhat differently. In John's gospel, Jesus has been very intentionally moving towards this. In some of the synoptics, there's more of a sense of inevitability about this. But in John, it's really like this is Jesus's goal, and he's going to do what he needs to do. So that's where we're at. We'll be looking at this story on Sunday morning. It's going to be kind of like a Good Friday service this Sunday. We're going to be singing a lot of those Good Friday type songs, which for some of you, if you're used to going to Good Friday services, this is going to be very familiar. If you're somebody who's never been to a Good Friday service, it's going to be kind of different. It's a different tone. Poor Marty Smith has to do a children's sermon about this, which, he drew the short straw on that one because it's not an easy story to talk about with the kids. But I'm sure he's going to do a fantastic job. So that's all I got for today. Have a blessed day, and I'll talk to you later. See you Sunday.